A student vanished in 1992. 32 years later, workers found a hidden tunnel beneath the school. The workers thought it was just another day of demolition. A Tuesday morning in the spring of 2024, dust rising from the skeleton of the old humanities building, the steady hum of machinery filling the air. One of them, a man named Tom, swung his pickaxe into a stubborn section of wall that refused to give way. The concrete crumbled, revealing something hollow behind it. He leaned closer. The air that rushed out smelled different, damp and stale, like a breath that had been held for decades. Inside was an opening, a narrow passage, dark and brick-lined, leading down beneath the school. The men froze. They called for flashlights, and as the beam of light sliced through the tunnel, the sight stopped them cold. Torn fabric, rusted metal, and on the dirt floor, a student's ID card with the year 1992 stamped across the top. It belonged to a girl who had vanished without a trace 32 years earlier. But to understand this moment, we need to go back to where it all began. 1992 was a year suspended between two worlds. The music was loud and rebellious, Nirvana blasting through dorm room speakers, Whitney Houston floating from car radios. Students walked across campus with heavy backpacks and crumpled notebooks. No cell phones buzzing in their pockets, no internet to fact-check the rumors that spread like wildfire. If you disappeared back then, there was no GPS to trace you, no text messages to retrace your steps. You could just vanish, and the silence that followed could last a lifetime. At the center of this story was a young woman named Claire Montgomery. She was 20 years old, a second-year student at the university, with shoulder-length dark hair and a laugh her friends swore you could hear across the quad. Claire wasn't the type of girl who faded into the background. She was lively, warm, quick-witted, the kind of person who made you feel like you'd known her for years, even if you'd only just met. She grew up in a small town 2 hours away, the youngest of 3 siblings, the one her parents still called their baby, even though she had already moved into a dorm room and declared a major in English literature. She wanted to be a writer, maybe even a journalist, the kind who dug up stories that mattered. She carried a battered leather journal with her everywhere, scribbling notes, quotes, even overheard conversations. Her friends teased her for being old-fashioned, always with pen and paper, always observing the world like it was material for a story. But she was the one they went to for advice, the one who remembered birthdays, who left post-it notes on their doors when they were stressed before exams. The night she disappeared, nothing seemed out of the ordinary. It was late October, the kind of evening where the air smelled of damp leaves and chimney smoke. Claire had been in the library until nearly 9, working on a paper about Gothic literature. She checked out a stack of books, waved goodnight to the librarian, and walked across the dimly lit campus toward her dorm. A roommate later said she never made it back. The details that followed were sparse and frustrating. A classmate swore he saw her near the student union around 9:30, but his memory wavered under questioning. Another student claimed Claire had mentioned meeting someone that night, though no one could say who. Her journal, usually glued to her side, was left on her desk in her dorm, half filled with notes from earlier that day. By the time midnight rolled around and Claire still hadn't returned, her roommates grew anxious. She wasn't the type to vanish without saying anything. She didn't drink heavily, didn't party recklessly, and always told someone where she was going. At 1 in the morning, they called campus security. By dawn, Claire's parents were on the road, driving through the fog to the campus, their headlights cutting across empty fields as they tried to steady their shaking hands on the wheel. The last confirmed sighting of Claire was the library exit at 8:57 p.m. After that, it was as if the earth had swallowed her whole. Her dorm room still carried her scent, the faint mix of shampoo and cinnamon gum. Her desk lamp was left on, illuminating the stack of books on Gothic novels. A sweater was draped over the back of her chair. A photo of her family, taped to the mirror, caught her mother's eye and brought her to tears. It was the ordinariness of it that was unbearable. It looked like she had just stepped out for a moment and would return any second, laughing, brushing her hair out of her face, apologizing for worrying everyone. But that moment never came. Police began interviewing students, faculty, anyone who might have seen her. Flyers with her picture, a black and white photocopy of her smiling face, were plastered across campus. Missing student, last seen October 27, 1992. Her friends clung to hope at first. Maybe she had run off on some impulsive adventure. Maybe she had needed space. but deep down, they knew it didn't fit. This wasn't Claire. And within days, the whispers began. Some said she had a secret boyfriend, older, not a student. Others claimed she had uncovered something in her research, something about the university itself. There were darker rumors, too, about tunnels beneath the campus, remnants of old Prohibition-era pathways, forgotten and sealed up. Students whispered about hazing rituals, about secret societies, about things that happened after dark in places no one was supposed to go. Her family clung to each new detail like a lifeline, while the police struggled with the lack of physical evidence. No body, no crime scene, no clear suspects. Just a girl who had walked into the October night and never returned. For weeks, the search dominated local news. Candlelight vigils lit up the quad. Volunteers combed through nearby woods, fields, and creeks. Helicopters circled overhead. But winter came, snow covering the ground, and still, there was nothing. The case grew colder with each passing month, and whispers turned into silence. Claire's parents returned home eventually, but they never let go. Every holiday, every birthday, they set a place at the table for her. Her journal remained in her mother's hands, read over and over, searching for clues that weren't there. And as the years stretched on, the world moved forward. Students graduated, new faces filled the dorms, professors retired. The campus grew, buildings were renovated, new technology changed everything. But for those who remembered 1992, the story of Claire Montgomery never faded. She was the ghost of the university, the girl on the flyers, the name whispered in the halls whenever someone mentioned the word disappearance. And then, in 2024, when the workers broke through that wall and found the tunnel, her name came roaring back into the headlines, as if she had never been gone at all. Because the tunnel wasn't empty, it was holding a secret, one that had been waiting 32 years to be uncovered. The search begins. The morning after Claire Montgomery failed to return to her dorm, the campus felt different. Students walked in clusters, whispering, clutching their coffee cups tighter, glancing over their shoulders. Word had spread faster than the official notices. By sunrise, her roommates had already been interviewed by campus security. They repeated the same story again and again. Claire had gone to the library. She said she'd be back by 10. She never came home. Her bed was still made. Her jacket still hung on the back of her chair, and she hadn't taken her car keys. Her parents arrived by mid-morning, their sedan pulling into the lot just as fog began to burn off the grass. Her mother, Evelyn, hurried inside the dorm without even shutting her car door. She rushed into Claire's room and froze in the doorway. The sight of it was too normal, too lived in. A cup of tea half-finished on the nightstand, a pile of laundry in the corner, a stack of index cards with scribbled notes about Gothic novels. Evelyn sat on her daughter's bed, clutching the pillow, inhaling the faint trace of shampoo still clinging to the sheets. Her father, Richard, stood stiffly by the window, gripping the sill so hard his knuckles turned white. Parents always think they'll know what to do in an emergency, but in that moment, they were lost. Police were called in within hours. At first, the local department handled it, sending 2 detectives to campus. They spoke with the roommates, the librarian who saw her check out books, the student who thought he saw her near the Union. But their notes were thin. Nothing lined up into a solid lead. Still, in those first 24 hours, no one wanted to believe the worst. The detectives suggested maybe she'd run away, maybe she'd taken off with a boyfriend, maybe she was blowing off steam. Evelyn slammed her hand on the desk. My daughter didn't run away. She was supposed to come home this weekend for her sister's birthday. She made a cake reservation at the bakery. She wouldn't just disappear. Her anger filled the room, and in a way, she was right. This wasn't a case of rebellion. This wasn't a girl fleeing responsibility. Something had happened. By the second night, posters were already being printed. Claire's smiling face, photocopied so many times that the lines blurred. Students tacked them to lampposts, bulletin boards, the walls of the dining hall. Volunteers carried stacks of flyers downtown, posting them in shop windows and gas stations. The flyer read, "Missing student. Last seen October 27, 1992. That weekend, the first search party formed. Students, parents, and townspeople gathered with flashlights and dogs, combing the wooded area just beyond the soccer fields. They trudged through mud, their boots crunching over brittle leaves. Some called out her name, others walked in silence, afraid of what they might find. Helicopters flew overhead, their spotlights cutting through the darkness. On the ground, police pushed into abandoned sheds, drainage tunnels, even the edge of the riverbank. Every place seemed like it might hold an answer, but every search ended the same way, empty-handed. The news picked up the story quickly. Local channels ran segments with her parents pleading for help. National networks soon followed, sending vans and reporters to campus. Suddenly, students saw cameras stationed near the library, journalists cornering them with questions about whether they knew Claire. Her friends huddled together in the dining hall, eyes red, plates untouched. They replayed her last day in their minds, clinging to every tiny detail. Did she seem different? Did she say anything unusual? Did she seem nervous, distracted, scared? But the truth was, she had been her usual self, laughing in class, scribbling in her notebook, making plans for the weekend. Nothing about her hinted at vanishing. The pressure mounted quickly. Detectives expanded their interviews to faculty and staff. They searched her dorm room again and again, collecting her notebooks, her desk lamp, even the sheets from her bed. They checked her bank account, no withdrawals. They checked her phone records, though, in 1992, that meant payphones and calling cards. Nothing suspicious. And still, the case gave nothing back. By the end of the week, panic had shifted into obsession. Rumors spread like wildfire across campus. Some claimed to have seen her walking near the old chapel after dark. Others whispered that she had a secret lover, an older man no one knew. Still others said she had been looking into something for a writing project, something about the university itself. The most chilling rumor, though, was the one about the tunnels. For decades, stories circulated about underground passages beneath the school. Some said they dated back to Prohibition, used to sneak liquor across town. Others swore they were remnants of the 19th century, when the university was built on old farmland. Students claimed to hear strange noises at night, echoes of footsteps beneath the ground. Most brushed it off as just campus folklore, but now, with Claire gone, the stories came alive again. The police, for their part, tried to keep focus. They organized another search, this time expanding into town. Officers went door to door, asking if anyone had seen her. They checked hotels, bus stations, even highway toll booths. At one point, a waitress in a diner swore she'd seen a girl who matched Claire's description, eating pie alone at midnight. That lead fizzled out. Another tip claimed she had been spotted hitchhiking near the interstate. That too went nowhere. The strain on her family was immediate. Evelyn barely slept, sitting by the dorm phone waiting for a call that never came. Richard threw himself into coordinating with police, printing maps, organizing search routes, anything to stay busy. Their other children felt the weight of absence too. Birthdays and holidays became somber, gatherings centered around the empty chair. And through it all, the campus grew restless. Night after night, candlelight vigils were held. Hundreds of students stood in silence, candles flickering against the autumn wind, holding hands, whispering prayers. Some left notes and flowers outside the library doors, as if marking the last place she had been seen. One of Claire's close friends, a girl named Jenna, spoke at a vigil. Her voice cracked as she clutched the microphone. Claire was supposed to write stories about the world. She was supposed to graduate, to make us laugh at our 10-year reunion. She wasn't supposed to disappear. The crowd fell into silence after her words. It wasn't just grief, they felt it was fear. If Claire could vanish from campus without a trace, it meant any of them could too. And fear is fertile ground for rumors. Whispers spread of secret societies, professors with hidden pasts, even satanic cults, fueled by the satanic panic of the early 90s. Some claimed the tunnels beneath the school were used for rituals. Others said Claire had been researching Gothic novels not just for class, but because she was onto something hidden in the school archives. The detectives, meanwhile, faced growing frustration. They had no evidence of foul play, no body, no blood, no sign of struggle. Without that, the case was slippery. They couldn't even rule out the possibility she had left voluntarily. But Evelyn refused to let them drift in that direction. She appeared on television, holding up her daughter's picture. Claire didn't run away. Somebody took her. And we need your help to find her. Her words cut through the speculation, bringing the focus back to the heart of it. A young woman was gone, and somewhere, someone knew why. By the end of the second week, the case had become the talk of the state. Hotlines flooded with calls. Psychics phoned in with visions. Truck drivers claimed to have seen her at rest stops. A dozen leads came in each day, each one exhausting the detectives, none leading to answers. The pressure was crushing. Students were warned not to walk alone at night. Parents pulled their kids out of campus housing, insisting they commute instead. The university administration tried to calm fears, but their statements rang hollow against the growing storm of rumor and grief. And through it all, one question lingered in every mind. Where was Claire Montgomery? It was a question that would go unanswered, not just for weeks or months, but for decades. Because the truth was buried deep beneath their feet, sealed away in darkness. And no one would see it for 32 long years. By the third week after Claire vanished, the campus had become a place of shadows. Students moved in clusters now, walking each other back to dorms at night. Even the loudest parties quieted down earlier than usual, their laughter feeling forced. The emptiness of her absence hung over everything. But what no one could avoid were the whispers. Rumors had always thrived in the cracks of campus life, feeding on long nights and overworked imaginations. But now, they spread like wildfire, growing darker with each retelling. In dining halls, in hushed dorm rooms, in late-night study groups, students leaned close and shared theories, each one stranger than the last. At first, it was simple. Some swore they saw Claire walking near the chapel after her last sighting. Others insisted she'd been spotted in a car that sped off campus. Someone claimed she was planning to transfer schools, and maybe she had left on her own. But then came the darker stories. One rumor said Claire had been dating a professor. No one knew which one the name changed depending on who was telling the story. A history professor, a literature professor, a philosophy professor. Each time, the details shifted, but the idea stuck. Maybe someone older, with more power, had wanted to keep the relationship a secret. Maybe she had threatened to expose them. Maybe that was why she disappeared. Another story centered around her writing. Students remembered the way Claire scribbled in her journal constantly, the way she collected conversations like treasures. One girl from her creative writing class swore that Claire had been working on something unusual before she vanished, a piece about the hidden history of the university. The story went that she had discovered something in the archives, something about the school's foundations, and that she had told someone she planned to dig deeper. And that's where the whispers of tunnels began to take hold. The tunnels were an old piece of campus folklore, mentioned occasionally in jest but never taken too seriously. Supposedly, back in the early 1900s, underground passages had been built beneath the main buildings, connecting basements and storage rooms. Some said they were used during Prohibition to move alcohol unseen. Others claimed they were escape routes, built in case of fires. Over the decades, students claimed to hear things late at night, strange echoes beneath their feet, the clank of pipes when no one was in the basement. Some said you could even feel faint drafts in certain hallways, as though air was moving from a place no one could reach anymore. Most people laughed it off. But now, in the aftermath of Claire's disappearance, the stories grew teeth. One student swore he'd seen a door in the basement of the old humanities building that was always locked. Another said they'd gone exploring and found a half-bricked archway beneath the chapel, like something had been sealed up long ago. Theories collided. Had Claire found her way into the tunnels? Had someone lured her there? Were the tunnels still in use, for something no one wanted to talk about? And then there were the stranger rumors still. In the early 90s, America was in the grip of what came to be known as the Satanic Panic. News stations ran stories about cults in the woods, ritual sacrifices, symbols painted on walls. Most of it was exaggerated or outright false, but it fed the imagination. On this campus, students whispered that the tunnels were used for rituals, that Claire had stumbled into the wrong place at the wrong time. One night, a group of students swore they heard something beneath the chapel, a muffled voice, a low chant echoing through the floorboards. They didn't investigate, they ran, terrified, their stories spreading like wildfire by morning. Even those who didn't believe in cults or tunnels felt a sense of unease. A janitor told police he'd heard footsteps in the locked basement after hours. A security guard claimed he once found a candle still burning in a corner of the boiler room, with no explanation for how it got there. None of it was proof, but all of it added fuel to the fire. Meanwhile, the administration tried to stamp out the gossip. They issued statements assuring parents and students that the campus was safe, that the disappearance was an isolated tragedy. But their silence about the rumors only made things worse. Every time they denied the existence of tunnels, students became more convinced they were hiding something. And perhaps most chilling were the notes. In the weeks after Claire vanished, Evelyn received 2 anonymous letters. The handwriting was jagged, hurried, like someone trying to disguise it. The first simply read, "She knew something she shouldn't have." The second said, "Check the old places. Not everything is closed off." The police dismissed them as cruel pranks, but Evelyn kept them, folded in her wallet, studying them until the paper grew soft and worn. To her, they were not random. They meant something. Her insistence kept the whispers alive. For years afterward, upperclassmen would tell freshmen about the girl who vanished. They'd point to the library steps, the chapel basement, the locked door in the humanities building. Some swore her ghost walked the quad at night, searching for her way home. Others claimed that on certain October nights, you could hear scratching sounds beneath the floors. It became legend, a mix of truth, fear, and folklore. But for Claire's family, it wasn't a ghost story. It was real. Their daughter was gone, and no matter how wild the rumors became, the fact remained. Somebody knew what had happened to her. The police grew frustrated with the lack of progress. The case stalled, their leads drying up one by one. But on campus, the whispers grew louder, filling the silence where answers should have been. And in the shadows, beneath the feet of every student who hurried across the quad at night, the truth lay buried, waiting. Because the tunnels weren't just a rumor, they were real. And someday, someone would break through the wall that hid them. At first, the case of Claire Montgomery seemed too big to ignore. She was young, bright, and full of promise. The kind of missing person story that tugged at public sympathy. The news crews stayed for weeks. Flyers covered every telephone pole and shop window. Volunteers still gathered in parking lots with flashlights and maps, ready to scour another patch of woods. But cases like this follow a cruel pattern. As the days turned into weeks, the energy began to fade. The search parties thinned. The news segments shrank, from front-page headlines to quick updates buried between weather and sports. By Christmas of 1992, only her family and closest friends were still fighting with the same urgency as day one. The investigation itself became tangled in its own dead ends. Detectives chased every lead, no matter how far-fetched. One day, they were interviewing a truck driver who claimed to have picked up a hitchhiker that looked like Claire on the interstate. Another day, they were standing in the woods following up on a psychic who insisted she'd had a vision of a body beneath the trees. Each tip consumed hours, sometimes days, of manpower. Each tip ended the same way: nothing. And the more nothing they found, the more frustrated everyone became. Detective Alan Crawford, one of the lead investigators, later admitted in an interview that he felt the case slipping through his fingers. "We had her last sighting at the library exit," he said. "After that, nothing. It's like she stepped into thin air. You keep waiting for the thing that ties it all together, a witness, a scrap of clothing, a car sighting, but it never came." The lack of physical evidence was devastating. Her dorm room offered no clues. Her car sat untouched in the lot. Her bank account remained frozen. Without something tangible to hold on to, the investigation became a maze of speculation. And speculation breeds mistakes. At one point, police briefly focused on a man who lived near campus, a loner with a criminal record who'd been seen wandering the quad at night. Rumors swirled that he had been stalking students. For weeks, the community fixated on him as the likely suspect. But surveillance and questioning turned up nothing, and eventually, the suspicion faded. The damage, however, had been done. Claire's family watched helplessly as time and energy were poured into dead ends, while the real trail, whatever it was, grew colder by the hour. Tension between the Montgomery family and law enforcement mounted. Evelyn pushed relentlessly, calling the station daily, demanding updates, urging them not to give up. Richard tried to balance anger with diplomacy, but even he admitted to friends that he felt the police weren't doing enough. Behind closed doors, officers muttered that the family was becoming difficult. But how could they not be? Their daughter was gone. The world expected them to accept silence, and they couldn't. By spring of 1993, Claire's face was no longer on the nightly news. The flyers had yellowed in the rain. New tragedies had filled the headlines. The case file grew thicker, but not with answers, only with interviews, maps, false leads, and unanswered questions. And the whispers on campus never really stopped. Some students swore the police were covering something up. Others believed the administration had pressured detectives to keep quiet about certain leads. to protect the university's reputation. There was talk of sealed records, of witnesses who suddenly changed their stories. None of it could be proven. But for the Montgomery family, it was enough to keep suspicion alive. In late 1993, the case officially shifted from active to cold. The detectives still said they followed up on tips, still claimed the investigation was ongoing. But the truth was, momentum had died. For Evelyn, the shift was unbearable. She refused to let her daughter's story fade into the background. She contacted newspapers, appeared on talk shows, sat for interviews on local radio. She told and retold Claire's story, holding her picture up, her voice unwavering. "She is still out there. Somebody knows something. We will not stop until we find her." The toll on the family was heavy. Holidays became rituals of absence. Every birthday, every Christmas, Claire's siblings watched their mother light a candle in her place. The air around the table was heavy, every laugh fragile, every silence louder than words. Friends who had once been close to the Montgomerys began to drift away, unsure of how to comfort people who lived with constant grief. Some neighbors avoided eye contact in the grocery store, afraid of saying the wrong thing. The family's life had been split into a before and after, and the world around them kept moving forward, leaving them stuck. And through it all, the campus carried its ghost. Students graduated, professors retired, new freshmen arrived who had never even heard of Claire until someone mentioned the legend at a party. Her name became a story told in hushed tones. "Did you hear about the girl who vanished from the library?" They never found her. Every October, when the air grew cold and leaves crunched underfoot, the whispers returned louder than ever. Some students swore they saw her reflection in the library windows at night. Others claimed to hear footsteps in the basements of old buildings. She became part of the folklore of the school, the missing girl who never came home. But for her family, folklore was an insult. Claire wasn't a ghost story. She was their daughter. She was a young woman with dreams and laughter, and an unfinished journal waiting on her desk. And the silence of the investigation was a wound that never healed. By the end of that first year, everyone had settled into their roles. The police moved on to new cases. The administration focused on reassuring parents that campus was safe. Students turned her story into whispers and myths, and the Montgomery family carried their grief, louder and heavier than anyone else could imagine. The investigation had stalled. The trail was cold. And somewhere beneath the school, sealed away in the dark, the truth remained hidden patient, waiting for the day it would finally claw its way back into the light. Time has a way of dulling even the sharpest wounds. But for the Montgomery family, the years after 1992 were not a matter of healing. They were a matter of surviving. At first, every day was consumed by the search. Evelyn woke before dawn, calling police stations in neighboring counties, checking the answering machine for messages, writing letters to talk shows and newspapers. She had stacks of flyers in her car trunk, always ready to hand one out. Richard poured himself into organization, drawing maps, making spreadsheets, filing away tips and leads. They thought that if they worked hard enough, if they kept her name in the public eye, the case couldn't possibly disappear the way Claire had. But as weeks stretched into months, and months into years, the momentum faded. Reporters stopped calling. The flyers came down, the search parties dissolved, and still, no one knew what had happened. By 1995, Claire's disappearance had become a cold case in every sense of the word. The file sat in the police department's cabinets, pulled out only when a new tip came in, which grew less and less frequent. The family's calls went unanswered more often. The detectives who had once sat across from them, promising to get to the bottom of this, were reassigned or retired. Life continued, as unbearably as that seemed. Claire's siblings graduated, got married, had children of their own. Family photos were taken with one space always left in the middle. Every milestone was shadowed by absence. When her older sister, Caroline, gave birth to her first child, Evelyn cried not just from joy, but because she thought of how Claire would never meet her niece. At holidays, the empty chair became tradition. Thanksgiving dinners with laughter and clinking glasses would pause when someone glanced at the candle burning at Claire's place. Birthdays were marked with a cake that was never eaten. Each ritual was both an act of love and a reopening of the wound. Friends of the family drifted away, some out of discomfort, unsure of what to say after years of not knowing, others because life simply moved on. But the Montgomerys stayed frozen in 1992, unable to let the calendar carry them forward. Evelyn, especially, refused to give in to silence. She became known as the woman who kept her daughter's case alive. She gave interviews on the anniversaries. She wrote letters to governors and senators. She pushed police chiefs to revisit the case every few years, though nothing ever came of it. Her house filled with binders of newspaper clippings, phone logs, maps, and her own handwritten notes. Some nights, she stayed up until dawn, cross-referencing scraps of information, chasing a truth that never revealed itself. Richard carried the weight differently. He worked longer hours, fixed things around the house obsessively, anything to keep his hands busy. In the evenings, he sometimes sat on the porch in silence, staring at the empty driveway as if waiting for a car that never came. His grief was quieter than Evelyn's, but just as heavy. The strain took its toll on their marriage. Arguments broke out over the police, over money, over how to talk to the other children about Claire. There were nights when Evelyn accused him of giving up, and nights when he accused her of driving herself to exhaustion. And yet, they stayed together, bound not just by love, but by the shared burden of loss. For Claire's friends, the years were complicated. They went on with their lives, graduated, built careers. Some stayed in touch with the Montgomerys, sending holiday cards, calling on anniversaries. Others drifted away, unable to carry the weight of grief for someone who had vanished from their day-to-day world. Yet all of them carried her memory in some form. A song on the radio, a stack of books, a laugh in a crowded room that sounded almost like hers. And on campus, her story became folklore. Every few years, a new class of freshmen would hear about the girl who disappeared. Upperclassmen told the story in hushed voices at parties, pointing to the library doors, the chapel basement, the locked door in the old humanities building. Claire became a cautionary tale, a name whispered when someone walked home alone at night. By the 2010s, the case was a ghost story. Students held mock ghost hunts in the basements of old buildings. Some claimed to have seen her reflection in windows or heard footsteps in empty hallways. What had once been tragedy had twisted into legend, and the weight of that hurt Evelyn most of all. Because to her, Claire wasn't a story. She was flesh and blood. She was her daughter. Decades passed. Evelyn's hair turned gray. Richard's shoulders stooped. The siblings raised children who grew up hearing about their aunt, the woman they had never met but felt they somehow knew. The world changed: cell phones, the internet, social media tools that might have saved Claire if they had existed in 1992. But for her, the timing had been wrong. She had disappeared in the last gasp of an era when people could simply vanish into thin air. Every October, the anniversary brought a surge of grief. Some years, a local paper would run a short article, "Family Still Seeks Answers in 1992 Disappearance." But more often, the date passed quietly, marked only by candles in the Montgomery home. Still, Evelyn never stopped. She attended vigils for other missing people, lent her voice to support groups, and told anyone who would listen that her daughter was not forgotten. She carried Claire's journal everywhere, the leather cover worn soft from decades of handling. She read and reread the words inside, listening for hidden messages in her daughter's handwriting. And then, as the years reached into the third decade, the silence grew nearly unbearable. 32 years had passed. The case was older than some of the officers now working in the department. Older than the current students walking across the quad. For many, it was just a piece of history. For the Montgomerys, it was still the present. They had no answers, no justice, no closure. Just silence. But silence doesn't last forever, because in 2024, on an ordinary spring morning, when construction workers broke through the wall of the old humanities building, silence gave way to something else. The truth had been buried all along. And now, after 32 years, it was ready to be found. It was just another Tuesday morning in April of 2024. The old humanities building had been closed for years, its windows boarded, its classrooms filled with dust and broken chairs. The university had finally approved renovations to convert it into a modern student center, and the demolition crew was making quick work of the job. The men on site had no idea they were about to change everything. Around mid-morning, one of the crew, a man named Tom Daniels, was working on tearing down a section of the basement wall. He'd been swinging a pick at stubborn concrete, sweat dripping into his eyes. At first, it felt no different than the dozens of other walls he'd knocked down in his career. But then, something odd happened. With one sharp crack, the wall gave way not into solid concrete, but into hollow space. A burst of air escaped, cool and stale, with a smell that was instantly different. It was the scent of earth long sealed off, mixed with dampness and something sharper metallic, almost like rust. Tom leaned closer, his pickaxe still resting against the broken wall. "Hey," he called to the others, "this ain't right." The crew gathered around, pulling out flashlights. The beam of light cut into the dark void, revealing bricks, old and crumbling, forming a narrow passage that sloped downward into shadow. The workers stood silent. Construction crews find strange things all the time: old pipes, forgotten rooms, even abandoned storage. But this was different. This was a tunnel. And by the looks of it, it hadn't been touched in decades. The foreman called the university project manager, who quickly ordered the site shut down until it could be assessed. But before they sealed it off, one worker shined his flashlight farther into the opening, and that's when they saw it. On the dirt floor, half buried beneath rubble, was a torn piece of fabric. Next to it, rusted metal, what looked like the frame of an old folding chair. And further back, glinting under the beam, was something small and rectangular. One of the men reached in and pulled it out. The plastic was brittle, yellowed with age, but the photo was still there, faint but unmistakable. It was a student ID card, and stamped across the top, 1992. The name on the card was Claire Montgomery. The discovery spread like wildfire. By the afternoon, the campus was buzzing with rumors, just like it had in the early 90s. But this time, it wasn't whispers. This time, it was real. Police cordoned off the site within hours. The construction crew was questioned, their tools left in place as evidence teams descended into the opening. Students gathered outside the chain-link fences, phones in hand, snapping pictures of the squad cars and flashing lights. For many, Claire Montgomery was just a story they'd heard: the ghost girl, the missing student whose face once stared down from black and white flyers. Now her name was back in bold print, her story no longer just a legend. Inside the tunnel, investigators moved carefully. The passage was narrow, brick-lined, with sections that looked like they might collapse if touched. Dirt coated the floor, and the air was thick, damp, suffocating. But as the beams of their flashlights swept across the walls, they saw marks, faint scratches, as if someone had dragged something heavy. Further in, they found more fragments: a shoe sole, a rusted lighter, bits of paper so degraded they crumbled at the touch. Every detail was bagged and tagged, every inch of the tunnel photographed. At one point, an officer paused, shining his light higher on the wall. There, faint but undeniable, was a smear that had darkened into the brick itself. Testing would later confirm what everyone already suspected: blood. The ID card was the most direct evidence. For decades, there had been no trace of Claire. And now, here was something that had belonged to her, buried in a tunnel no one even knew existed. The Montgomery family got the call that afternoon. Evelyn, now 72, answered the phone herself. Her hands trembled as the officer explained what had been found. She dropped into a chair, the room spinning around her. Richard sat down across from her, his face pale. After 32 years, they were hearing their daughter's name from the police again. It wasn't closure, not yet. But it was something. News vans arrived on campus before nightfall. Reporters stood in front of the taped-off building, speaking into cameras with urgency. Breaking developments today in a 32-year-old cold case. A hidden tunnel has been discovered beneath the university. Authorities confirm that evidence linked to missing student Claire Montgomery has been found inside. For the first time in decades, the investigation was alive again. Students huddled around their phones, scrolling through old news archives, staring at pictures of Claire's smiling face. Some said the stories about tunnels had been true all along. Others whispered about curses, about secrets the university had buried. The police said little publicly, only that the tunnel was being carefully excavated and that forensic teams would need weeks, if not months, to process what was inside. But behind closed doors, the discovery shook them. Because tunnels like this don't just appear, they are built, and someone, at some point, had gone to great lengths to seal it away. The question was no longer just, what happened to Claire Montgomery? The question now was, who knew about this tunnel, and why had it been hidden for so long? As night fell on the campus, floodlights illuminated the fenced-off site. Officers guarded the entrance, their radios crackling in the cool spring air. Students lingered, unable to pull themselves away from the sight. Something had been uncovered, something that had waited 32 years in silence. And whatever secrets it held, the world was finally ready to hear them. The tunnel was more than just a hidden passage. It was a time capsule, a wound stitched shut and left to fester beneath the university for over 3 decades. The morning after the discovery, police cordoned off not just the old humanities building but the surrounding area as well. A white tent was erected over the entrance. Forensic vans rolled in. Investigators in white Tyvek suits and masks filed down into the opening like astronauts entering an alien world. The work was slow. The tunnel was narrow, the bricks unstable, every step echoing in the hollow space. At first, they treated it like any other excavation, cataloging items, taking photos, measuring distances. But the deeper they went, the stranger it became. The first clear discovery was a folding chair, rusted to the point of collapse. It sat crooked against the wall, half buried in dirt. Next to it was a length of rope, frayed and stiff. The implications were immediate and chilling. A little further in, the beams of flashlights picked up writing on the walls, not graffiti sprayed with cans, but words scratched directly into the brick. Some were too eroded to read. Others were clearer, carved deep with something sharp. Don't trust them. They watch. Help. The words crawled across the walls in uneven lines, overlapping one another. They weren't the markings of casual vandals. They looked desperate. The team pressed on. Every few feet brought another fragment, scraps of fabric, rusted cans, broken glass. At one point, they found what looked like a student notebook, its pages fused together with moisture, the ink bleeding into illegibility. Forensics promised to attempt restoration, though no one knew how much could be saved. But the most unnerving discovery came at the far end of the passage. The tunnel abruptly dead-ended into a wall of brick and mortar. Unlike the old, crumbling sections behind them, this wall was different. It was newer, cleaner. As if someone had sealed it deliberately, decades after the rest of the tunnel had been abandoned. Detectives stared at the wall, the beam of their flashlights bouncing off the uneven mortar lines. Someone had built this. Someone had wanted to keep whatever lay beyond hidden. They ordered the wall broken carefully, brick by brick. Behind it was another chamber, smaller, square, almost like a room. Inside, the floor was littered with debris, torn cloth, bottles, a single shoe, and, in the corner, something that made even the most hardened investigators fall silent. It was a necklace. A delicate chain with a tiny charm, still recognizable despite the years. When Evelyn Montgomery was shown a photograph later that week, she collapsed into tears. It was Claire's necklace, a gift she had received on her 16th birthday. She had worn it nearly every day since. The evidence was damning. News of the necklace leaked almost immediately. Reporters swarmed the campus, their microphones catching the voices of shocked students and tearful alumni. "It's like she never left," one graduate said, staring at the old building. "She's been here the whole time and we never knew." The discovery sent ripples far beyond the campus. Cold case experts weighed in on national broadcasts. True crime podcasts released emergency episodes. Social media exploded with theories. The whispers of tunnels, once treated as myth, were now fact. And the university found itself at the center of a storm. Administrators held a press conference, their faces tight, insisting they had no knowledge of the tunnel, that its existence had been a complete surprise. But students didn't buy it. Alumni flooded online forums with stories about locked doors, strange drafts, and professors who brushed off questions about the school's foundations. Some claimed the administration had always known, that they had chosen silence over scandal. Theories multiplied. Some said the tunnel had been used during Prohibition, then forgotten. Others argued it was built for maintenance or storage. But darker theories circulated too. Hazing rituals, secret societies. Even rumors of cult activity came back with new intensity. For investigators, however, one fact was unavoidable. The tunnel wasn't just a relic, it was connected to Claire's disappearance. Her ID card, her necklace, the rope, the scratches on the wall. These weren't coincidences. The question now wasn't if Claire had been there, it was who had put her there. Detectives began re-examining every detail of the original case. Old interviews were pulled from storage. Witness statements were reread, reanalyzed. Former students and faculty were tracked down, asked if they remembered anything strange in the fall of 1992. The Montgomery family, for the first time in decades, felt a glimmer of hope. Not the kind that imagined Claire walking through the door that hope had long since been extinguished, but hope that answers might finally come, that the silence might finally break. Still, the discoveries raised new and unsettling questions. Why had the tunnel been sealed? Who knew about it and chose to bury it? And, most haunting of all, what really happened to Claire in that underground passage 32 years ago? The tunnel had changed everything. For 32 years, Claire Montgomery's disappearance had been an unsolved tragedy that slowly slipped into legend. But the necklace, the scratched words on the walls, the sealed chamber, these were no longer whispers. They were evidence. The cold case unit assigned to Claire's file reopened it immediately. Boxes of old reports were pulled from storage, their cardboard lids sagging with age. Inside were photographs, handwritten notes, cassette tapes of interviews. The officers handling the case now were younger than Claire had been when she disappeared, but they leaned in, hungry to find what their predecessors could not. The first step was to retrace the investigation. Detectives spread the case file across long tables, combing through the details of 1992. The last sighting at the library, the classmate who swore he saw her near the Union, the roommate who insisted she planned to be home by 10, the waitress who thought she saw her eating pie at midnight. Every name, every address, every statement was re-examined. Some leads were dead before they started. Witnesses had died, buildings had been torn down, memories had faded. But others were still reachable, living quiet lives far from campus, surprised to get a knock on their door 32 years later. The first major re-interview was with Jenna Parker, Claire's old roommate and closest friend. She was 52 now, a high school teacher with 2 grown kids. Sitting across from the detectives, she admitted she had never stopped thinking about that night. She wasn't the type to vanish, Jenna said, her voice trembling. I knew it then, and I know it now. Somebody took her. I've never doubted that. Jenna remembered something else, too, a detail she said she thought was too small to matter back in '92. Claire had mentioned, just once, that she was going to talk to a professor about something she found in the archives. She didn't say who, she didn't say what, but Jenna swore she seemed nervous about it. That sent detectives back into faculty records. Most of the professors from the early '90s were retired, but a few were still alive, scattered across the country. Some agreed to talk, others refused. But one name appeared in several student memories: Professor David Harrow, who had taught English literature. Harrow had been in his late 40s when Claire was in school, sharp-tongued, well-respected, and deeply interested in Gothic fiction. Students remembered him as brilliant but intimidating. Some remembered him as something more. Rumors of inappropriate relationships had circulated at the time, though none were proven. He had quietly retired in 2008 and moved to another state. Detectives contacted him, and while he denied any inappropriate relationship, his name resurfaced too often to ignore. Former students recalled Claire being in his office late, asking questions no one else dared. One remembered overhearing her mention tunnels in conversation with him. Meanwhile, forensic teams were still processing the tunnel. Soil samples, blood traces, fragments of paper. Each piece was tested with modern techniques that hadn't existed in '92. Luminol revealed faint outlines of more stains along the walls, confirming that violence had occurred there. DNA tests were underway on the rope and fabric, though decades underground had degraded much of it. As investigators pushed forward, the media followed every move. Claire's story became front-page news again, but this time, in the digital age, hashtags trended. Documentaries pitched their interest. Podcasts dissected every rumor. The country was hooked on the idea of a 32-year-old mystery finally cracking open. But with attention came pressure. The university faced growing scrutiny. Journalists dug into old records, searching for any mention of underground tunnels. Maintenance logs from the 1970s referenced restricted access points and sealed substructures. Maps showed faint outlines of passages that no longer appeared on modern plans. The administration issued careful statements, insisting they had no knowledge of the tunnel beneath humanities, but the public didn't believe them. Students protested on the quad, holding signs that read, "What else is buried here?" For the Montgomery family, the sudden spotlight was overwhelming. Evelyn, now frail but fierce, agreed to an interview on national television. Holding Claire's photograph, she looked straight into the camera. "We have waited 32 years for answers. My daughter's story is not folklore. She was real. She mattered. and I want to know who left her down there." The interview reignited public outrage. Pressure mounted on the university, on the police, on anyone who had been around in the fall of 1992. And then, another discovery pushed the case even further. In the sealed chamber beyond the tunnel wall, forensic teams found a scrap of paper that had survived just enough to be read. The ink was smeared, the edges blackened by moisture, but a few words stood out. "They can't know. If they find out, it's over." The handwriting matched samples from Claire's journals. She had written it. And whatever "they" meant, she had known something dangerous. The detectives leaned into the theory that Claire had uncovered a secret, something tied to the university, maybe even to the tunnels themselves. And if that was true, then her disappearance wasn't random. It was intentional. Someone had wanted her silenced. The question was, who? And as the investigators dug deeper, they realized the answer might not lie only in the past. Because some of the people tied to Claire's last days were still alive. And one of them might have been carrying a secret for 32 years. The words on the scrap of paper haunted investigators. "They can't know. If they find out, it's over." It was a clue, but it was also a warning. Claire Montgomery had written it herself, in her own handwriting, inside the tunnel where her belongings were found. She hadn't just stumbled down there by accident. She had known something, and someone had made sure she never walked back out. The question now was, what had she uncovered? Detectives turned their focus back to the fall of 1992. Through old interviews, they pieced together a timeline of Claire's final days. She had spent hours in the university library archives, pulling records that most students never touched. She had mentioned to her roommate that she wanted to talk to a professor about what she'd found. She had been fascinated by Gothic literature, but her research had veered into something stranger, something about the university itself. The name that kept surfacing was Professor David Harrow. In the early 90s, Harrow had been a respected but controversial figure on campus. Students admired his intellect, but whispered about his temper and his relationships with female students. He had been seen speaking privately with Claire more than once, and though he denied any inappropriate contact, the fact remained: she had trusted him enough to confide in him. When detectives tracked him down in 2024, he was 80 years old, living in a quiet suburb. He shuffled to the door with a cane, his hair white and thin. But when asked about Claire, his eyes narrowed. "I told the police everything back then," he said. "She was a bright girl, ambitious, but she was curious in ways that could be dangerous." "Dangerous how?" one detective asked. Harrow hesitated, his lips pressed into a thin line. "She was digging where she shouldn't have been. Some histories are buried for a reason." Harrow. When pressed for details, Harrow shut down, refusing to elaborate. But investigators walked away, convinced he knew more than he was willing to admit. Meanwhile, forensic teams made another breakthrough. Testing on the rope found in the tunnel revealed degraded DNA, not enough for a clean profile, but enough to rule out random contamination. Whoever had been down there with Claire had tied that rope, and while the DNA couldn't yet identify a suspect, it confirmed what many already believed. She hadn't gone willingly. The investigation widened. Detectives tracked down former maintenance workers, security guards, and administrators from the early 90s. One retired custodian, interviewed at his nursing home, recalled something strange. "There was a door," he said, "in the basement of humanities. Locked, always locked. They told us not to touch it, said it was unsafe, sealed for a reason. But sometimes late at night I'd hear things, voices, echoes, like somebody was down there." When asked who gave those orders, the custodian shook his head. "It came from above, the administration. They didn't want us poking around." Theories that had once seemed wild tunnels, cover-ups, secret knowledge, now seemed less like myths and more like truths people had been trying to bury. And then came the most damning revelation of all. A set of maintenance logs from 1992, buried deep in university archives, surfaced during the investigation. They contained routine notes about plumbing, heating, and electrical issues. But one entry stood out, dated October 28th, the morning after Claire vanished. Sealed lower passage in humanities per instruction. Work completed, entry no longer accessible. The handwriting belonged to a foreman who had since passed away, but the note was undeniable. The tunnel where Claire's belongings were found had been sealed the very next day. That couldn't be coincidence. Someone had known she was down there. Someone had ordered the tunnel sealed, and someone in the administration had signed off on it. When this detail leaked to the press, outrage erupted. Students marched across campus with signs reading, "Who knew?" and "Justice for Claire." Alumni flooded social media with memories of locked doors and whispered warnings. Reporters demanded answers from university officials, who scrambled to distance themselves from decisions made 32 years earlier. The Montgomery family, watching the storm unfold, felt both vindicated and enraged. They had always known Claire hadn't simply run away. Now they had proof that people had known and chosen silence. But the biggest question remained: who was responsible for what happened inside that tunnel? Detectives circled back to Harrow. His connection to Claire, his cryptic remarks, his interest in Gothic secrets, all of it cast a long shadow. But he wasn't the only one under suspicion. The order to seal the tunnel had come from administration, and administrators had names too. Some were dead, others were still alive, quietly retired in suburban neighborhoods. Investigators began knocking on doors, asking questions that hadn't been asked in 3 decades. Faces paled. Memories faltered, but patterns began to emerge, a culture of secrecy, a chain of decisions designed to protect the university at any cost. The picture that formed was darker than anyone expected. Claire hadn't been the victim of random violence. She had stumbled into something she wasn't meant to see. Whether it was corruption, abuse, or a hidden society within the school, the exact truth was tangled in decades of silence. But one fact was clear: Claire Montgomery had died because she knew too much. And the people who buried her story had been walking free ever since. The storm had been building for months, but when the maintenance logs surfaced, the entry showing the tunnel was sealed the morning after Claire vanished. It broke wide open. The public no longer saw Claire's case as just an unsolved mystery. It was a scandal, it was corruption, and it was cover-up. The university president at the time of Claire's disappearance had long since passed away, but his name suddenly filled headlines. Reporters dug through archived speeches, newspaper clippings, and budget reports, searching for any sign that he had known about the tunnel. Former board members were called for interviews. Some denied everything. Others admitted there had always been whispers about sealed substructures but claimed they were told it was for safety. But then one retired administrator, now in her 80s, spoke to the press. Her voice was raspy, but her words cut like a blade. "I told them not to do it," she said. "I begged them. I said it wasn't right. That girl's things were down there. But they told me we had to protect the school. They told me it was bigger than one student." The recording spread across social media like wildfire. Outrage boiled over. Candlelight vigils turned into protests. Students marched with signs demanding justice, chanting Claire's name. The campus that had once whispered her story now shouted it loud enough for the world to hear. For detectives, the pressure was immense. They needed more than rumors and outrage, they needed names. And so they returned again to the person at the center of every thread, Professor David Harrow. Harrow, frail and stooped at 80 years old, was brought in for questioning. This time, detectives pressed harder. They showed him the maintenance log. They showed him the photograph of Claire's necklace. They asked him, again and again, what she had come to him about in 1992. At first, he stonewalled. But as the hours dragged on, cracks began to show. "She was too curious," he muttered finally. "She found something she shouldn't have." "What did she find?" a detective asked. Harrow's eyes flickered, haunted. "The tunnels. She found the tunnels. She thought they were a story, a project. She wanted to expose them, but she didn't understand." "Didn't understand what?" Harrow shook his head. "The university isn't what you think it is. There are groups, people. They have always existed here, older than you can imagine. I couldn't stop them." His words were evasive, cryptic, but the implication was chilling. He wasn't admitting to killing Claire, but he was admitting knowledge and silence. Meanwhile, DNA analysis from the rope came back with a partial match. Not to Harrow, but to another name from the original case file, a former maintenance supervisor. The man had died in 2009, but his DNA had been stored in a criminal database from a prior conviction. The discovery painted a grim picture. Claire had likely been lured or forced into the tunnel. The maintenance crew had access, the professors had knowledge, and the administration had sealed it all away the very next morning. It wasn't one person. It was a system. A network of silence that stretched across faculty, staff, and administrators, all working to protect the reputation of the university at the cost of justice for one young woman. When the findings were announced publicly, the backlash was immediate. The current administration issued a formal apology, though it rang hollow to many. Lawsuits were filed. Alumni demanded independent investigations. For weeks, the campus was covered in flowers, candles, and photos of Claire, her smile shining from every lamppost and wall. And through it all, the Montgomery family stood in the center. Evelyn, now frail and leaning on a cane, stood before the cameras one final time. Her voice trembled, but her words were steady. For 32 years, they told us nothing. For 32 years, they let us believe she had vanished into thin air. But she didn't vanish. She was buried under their lies. My daughter deserved better. And now, at last, she has been found. Her words brought the crowd to silence. Some wept, others bowed their heads. The story that had once been whispered in dorm rooms had become a national reckoning. Justice, in the legal sense, was limited. The key figures directly responsible were either dead or beyond prosecution, but truth itself was a form of justice. For the Montgomerys, it was a kind of closure. Not peace, never peace, but at least an end to the silence. Claire's remains were never fully recovered. The tunnel had held only fragments: her necklace, her ID, the traces of blood. But in the summer of 2024, her family held a memorial service at last. Hundreds attended: former classmates, current students, neighbors, strangers who had followed her story for decades. Candles lit the evening air as her name was read aloud. Claire Montgomery, 20 years old, daughter, sister, friend, writer. Finally acknowledged, finally remembered. But even as the crowd dispersed and the candles burned down, one truth lingered like a shadow. There were still unanswered questions. What exactly had Claire discovered that made her a threat? Who gave the order to seal the tunnel, and why was that note buried for decades? And why, even after all these years, did so many of the people who knew the truth remain so afraid to speak? The reckoning had come, but the darkest secrets had yet to be fully revealed. The reckoning had come, but reckoning is not the same as closure. For the Montgomerys, for the investigators, for the students who now walked across a campus haunted by its own foundations, questions remained, questions too heavy to carry and too dark to answer. The tunnel beneath the old humanities building was excavated carefully, inch by inch, until every stone and scrap of earth had been sifted. Forensic teams combed the chamber where Claire's necklace was found. They tested every stain, every fragment, every shadow of evidence. And yet, one final discovery stopped them cold. It was found behind the sealed wall, buried in the dirt near the base of the chamber. A small tin box, rusted shut, its lid fused from decades of moisture. When the forensic team pried it open, inside were scraps of paper, brittle, stained, but legible enough to read. They were journal entries, written in Claire's handwriting. The entries were brief, hurried, sometimes only a sentence or two. They seemed written in fear, as if scrawled in stolen moments. Some were notes about what she had seen in the tunnels, old passageways, strange symbols carved into the walls, whispers she swore she heard when no one else was around. But one entry chilled investigators most of all. They know I found it. I can hear them at night. If I don't make it out, tell my family I didn't run away. Tell them I was right. The paper shook in Evelyn Montgomery's hands when detectives showed it to her. For decades, she had fought against the idea that her daughter had left by choice. Now, Claire herself had written proof. She hadn't left. She hadn't run away. She had been silenced because she was right about something the university had buried. The journal entries raised more questions than they answered. What had she found? Was it corruption, abuse, or something older and stranger tied to the tunnels? Who were the they she wrote about? But the most unsettling detail came not from Claire's words, but from the last page in the box. It wasn't written in her handwriting. It was written in someone else's. A single sentence, scrawled in thick, uneven letters. She was never alone down here. Forensics could not identify who wrote it. The handwriting matched no one in Claire's circle. No professor, no administrator, no known suspect. It was a message that had survived 32 years in silence, waiting to be found alongside her words. And it suggested something terrifying. Claire wasn't just trapped. She wasn't just silenced. She hadn't been alone in that tunnel. Even now, no one knows what that message truly meant. Was it written by someone who helped her, someone who hurt her, or someone who had been there long before her, hidden in the darkness beneath the school? The Montgomery family chose to hold on to Claire's words, not the haunting final message. They buried the journal with her memorial, finally laying to rest the only pieces of her that had been recovered. But for the students who still walk the campus, the story of Claire Montgomery is no longer just a ghost tale whispered in dorm rooms. It is a wound etched into the university's foundation. And every October, when the wind rattles through the old buildings and the basements creak in the night, some still swear they hear scratching beneath the floor. Some still say the tunnels are not empty. And when asked about the discovery, one investigator, a man who had crawled through every inch of the passage himself, offered the final word that lingers like a shadow over the case. He looked straight at the camera and said quietly, "We found her necklace. We found her journal. We found her fear carved into the walls. But the truth? The truth is, we never found who else was down there with her."